It's useful for you to think of the sale as a series of 4 linear and discrete conversations. You're vetting them to see if there's a good fit. That's a qualifying conversation. You're trying to win the deal in the end. That's a closing conversation. And once you learn a little bit about it, you realize the value of a value conversation, regardless of how you're pricing. Fairly standard in the sales world. And then I added one at the beginning that I call the probative conversation, which is where...
Welcome. This is Unfolding, the show where I unfold creative business minds. My name is Marko Pfann, and now I just want you to sit back and enjoy the show. Welcome back. Today we have a very special guest, someone that I was looking forward for a long time to talk to, and it's Blair Enns. Blair Enns is the founder of Win Without Pitching, and his work really inspired me to actually start my own business like 15, 20 years ago. And I'm so happy to have you on the show today, Blair. And the reason why I wanted to talk to you is because you already wrote 3 books and you just published your latest book called The 4 Conversations. So welcome, Blair. Hi.
Hi, Marco. Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here.
So you have done this book writing and teaching, training people around sales and pricing for a long time now. And I actually wanted to show you this. I bought this book in, I think, 2010 or something.
That's when it
It's
came
like
out.
full of notes and stuff. So you had a big impact. Why did you start that? Why did you start writing those books around sales?
I started writing books because I launched a consulting practice in 2002. And right from the beginning, I felt the pressure that I thought if I was going to be recognized as an expert in whatever it is I was doing, I felt the pressure to write a book. I actually launched my practice called Win Without Pitching in 2002 with a book that I co-authored with somebody. And the book was simply called Win Without Pitching, and it was a big blue folder binder, 3-ring binder, like Pricing Creativity behind you, larger.
Okay, even larger.
And the way that came about is I thought, okay, I'm going to launch a consulting practice. How do you do this? I thought, I have to write down everything I know. And once I wrote it down, I thought, this is pretty valuable. I should just sell it. And then I thought it would be ridiculous to charge $20 for a book. So I priced it at $1,000. I priced it at $995. And over the years, I would reduce the price to $4 and package it with some remote consulting, etc. But when I launched the business originally as a consulting practice, it's now a training company. I launched it with this $1,000 book, and which was a heretical idea. The idea that you could charge that $1,000 for a book. But I looked at it and I thought, it's more than a book. It's everything I know about how to do this, about how to sell creative services. So it would be a crime to price it based on the shape of the package, the fact that it's a book. So I priced it at $1,000. And then when I published the Win Without Pitching Manifesto, I took that book off. I quit selling it. In fact, it was a blend of my IP and somebody else's, and we parted company from a business point of view. So I don't even have the files for that book anymore.
Oh.
And I was giving a speech in Scotland a few years ago, and it was in the office. The venue being used was somebody's agency, fairly large agency. And at the end of the talk, I thanked him for donating his space to host this audience. And he said, oh yeah, no problem. He said, by the way, I have your first book. And I said, oh, the Win Without Pitching Manifesto? He said, no, the blue book. So we went upstairs and I took a picture of it. I don't own a copy of it. I don't have the files in it. I haven't seen it in years other than holding it for a few minutes about 5 years ago.
I actually have seen that post. I remember that post that it was a picture with that.
Yeah.
I do remember that. Yeah, that's pretty cool. So how your book has changed how creative thinks about selling, right? It was the first book that really gave us a structure on how to sell, how to have sales conversation. Actually, and I still remember that back in the days when I was still working as a creative, it changed my mind around what selling really is. So is that something you've experienced often within your career, that you actually shift people's mind with that book, with the idea around selling, especially with creatives, obviously?
That book has done well. And when I say done well, I almost treat it like a child that's gone out into the world and has had an impact in the world, has had a positive impact in the world. It served me well. It served other people well. It's an obscure book that serves a niche that has very quietly sold over 100,000 copies now.
Wow.
And it keeps going, even though it came out in 2010. Annual sales increased every year up until last year. I think they started to tail off a little bit. And with the launch of my third and most recent book, The Four Conversations, I expect the volume to go back up and sales of that book to start growing again. So I feel blessed to have heard from lots of people about the impact that book has had on them. And I want to say I'm proud of it, but it's almost like I don't know, it's almost like it's not mine. It was just that you're proud of your kids, but you don't take credit for what they do. So I'm proud of that child of mine, but there's only so much credit I'm going to take for it. I feel like maybe you've caught me in a spiritual moment. I just feel like it's its own thing and it's doing well.
I think it definitely changed a lot of minds in the creative industry. It's funny, like that you see this as its own entity, really. Like it's not you, you didn't do that. That's cool. So you wrote the Win Without Pitching manifesto. After that, you wrote Pricing Creativity, which is more tactical, I would say, like
Yeah.
teaching people more like how you actually do those conversations. And it has a beautiful folder as well. So
It's a very practical book and it's meant to look practical. It's to your point, the manifesto is a manifesto. It's a book of lofty ideas. And there's not a lot of specific advice on what to do, but there's enough in it. But you can discern from the principles, the 12 proclamations in the book, how you should act and some of the things you would do and wouldn't do. But it's not very prescriptive. That book, Pricing Creativity, which came out January of 2018. So is that 7 years ago? No, I think it's 8 years ago. 8 years ago. This is January 2025. I'm horrible at math. That book was a real, here's how to, very specific. Here's how to think about pricing. Here's how to change your pricing. Here's how to set pricing. So it was quite different in that way. And then, yeah, sorry, I'll stop there.
no, you keep continuing because the next
So I was
question.
just going to say the third book, the most recent book, The Four Conversations, A New Model for Selling Expertise, is actually a blend of both. So a lot of principles, similar voice to the manifesto. So it's got a bit of a manifesto voice, like a big being called to a higher calling type tone, but it is all specific advice.
Yeah, that's
It is basically the framework that we teach it's the whole model that we teach in our training.
I've noticed it's way deeper. It's way more technical, as you said. My question would be why this book and why now?
Trying to help as many people as possible, reach as many people as possible. I needed to put more specific advice out there in the world. So the manifesto, I've encountered a lot of people who've said, oh yeah, we do win without pitching. And then they would describe some of the things that they do. And I would think, where did you get that? We don't teach that. I would never, it's not a tactic or an approach I would advocate. Even even somebody who would come to a seminar, maybe not the full workshop because that's when they start to get it, but just reading the material that I've published over the years. And I have a podcast. I've been blogging for years. I've written 3 books now. People would talk about how inspired they were, and then they would speak to what they were doing or the challenge they were having. And I would think, how can you embrace these ideas and then go do that? It's in contradiction to these principles that you just told me were so beneficial to you. I realized people needed more information. So
That's interesting. So how did people mess that up? Like, how did creatives?
Well, I don't know that it's messing it up. I think this happens with books and ideas in general. I think we become inspired by them, but at the end, we remember very little, a small amount of information, and we remember more of the feeling. I have my first client in Australia who's become a very good friend of mine now over the years. I think if I quizzed him, he talks about how my work had transformed his business. But if you interviewed him about the specifics of, okay, what do you do? What are the specific win without pitching practices that you and your firm put in place? My bet is he could only really tell you one or two small things, because at the end of the day, his success is rooted in something very simple. I came along and said, it's okay to say no. It's okay to say no to
Yeah.
the clients who are asking you to do things. And that simple idea, somebody said, you're not in the service business. The customer isn't always right. You're the expert. You've got a strong point of view on how this should be done. Just speak up. And if somebody asks you to do something you don't want to do, or you don't think it makes sense to do, just tell them you're not going to do it. That's, in a nutshell, that idea. Some people are just waiting. They're just wired the right way, personality-wise, and they're just waiting for permission to behave the way they think they should behave, the way they want to behave, the way that's intuitive to them. They just need permission to be themselves. And those people, and this friend of mine, he's just wired the right way. He just needed to hear, now, like everything everybody else is doing that feels weird to you, just don't do it. Just trust your instinct. And then some people have poor instincts.
Okay,
And they need a whole lot more information.
That's so true. But it's you touched on something very important here, like this permission idea. Like we feel there's a way we would love to do things, but we don't consider it because it's not professional or whatever. And that's just something you don't do as a service company. Now, you just said you're not in the service business, right? You actually put people in a different kind of industry, a kind of business, and that's the business of expertise, really.
Yeah.
So would you say like any creative company can and should be like more an expert business than a service-based business?
I'm making a kind of a generalizing broad statement that's not entirely correct. I want people to take the spirit of it. If you're in the service business where it's like the customer's right even when they're wrong, it's just your job is to make them happy. That's not. There are times in your relationship with your clients that is true. And as my friend and podcast co-host David C. Baker says, you get hired for your expertise, you get fired for lack of service. You don't get hired for service. You get hired because somebody has a problem or a challenge. And if they're firing their previous service provider, studio, whomever they're working with, and you're replacing somebody, it's because they've screwed up. So they might have screwed up on the service front, but it's really just the last straw. When they're hiring somebody, there's usually some sort of a new initiative. And what they really want is expertise. So you get hired for your expertise, you get fired for lack of service.
That makes so much sense. And then now actually that also makes sense looking at the framework you have, the 4 conversations, which actually build that, it's a way to introduce your expertise to the client, right? And the authority and lead the client before you even work with them. How did you come up with that framework? You said you just wrote down what you knew. Is that something you intrinsically did when you sold creative services?
No. So I'm a bit of a model or a framework person. So if you're teaching, if you're in the advisory business of any kind, you need a structure for your guidance. So you need to be able to put it into a box. So I spent a lot of time messing with different models. So a model is a view of the world. And as I say at the beginning of the book, I quote this statistician who nobody has ever heard of other than this one quote for which he's somewhat famous, which is, all models are wrong, but some are useful.
Nice. Yeah.
I make the point, I'm just trying to set aside anybody's argument that it's not always 4 conversations. The sale doesn't happen in 4 conversations. My point is, I'm not saying that it does. I'm saying it's useful or can be useful for you to think of the sale as a series of 4 linear and discrete conversations. And I think makes sense to me too. There are some standard conversations in sales. You're qualifying somebody, you're vetting them to see if there's a good fit. That's a qualifying conversation. You're closing. You're trying to win the deal in the end. That's a closing conversation. I don't remember anymore if these are universally seen as distinct conversations in the sales world, but they are. And then once you discover the world of value-based pricing, whether you price based on value or not, once you learn a little bit about it, you realize the value of a value conversation, regardless of how you're pricing. So you have those would be three fairly standard, if not distinct conversations in the sales world. And then I added one at the beginning that I call the probative conversation, which is where you prove your expertise to the client and move in their mind from this position of vendor to expert. And that's the probative conversation is the most different of the others. It's essentially building reputation in
So
advance of the person-to-person conversation. And I don't know, they just all coalesced at some point, and I don't even remember when, 10 years ago maybe.
I'm curious, how would you advise a creative studio to do this first conversation where you build this reputation? If I would be afraid that the creatives start pitching in the first conversation when they want to build the credibility.
Yeah.
Do they avoid that? How do they avoid to come across as overly eager? Sorry.
Yeah.
And still provide value or still show that they're the expert and build some reputation.
First, I would say I'm putting myself back in myself in my early to mid 20s when I went to work in my first ad agency. It was a small, independent, regional. It was a full service marketing communication firm, a public relations firm that had bought a design firm, I think. And I went to work in their advertising department. And so if I put myself back in those shoes, I'd say that the listener, the first thing I would have you do is just forget everything about how your services should be sold. There are a lot of habits. There's a lot of baggage. Just strip it all away and just see this as 4 conversations. So the key to the model is 4 distinct conversations. At any point in the sale, you simply stop and ask yourself, okay, what conversation is this? It's the qualifying conversation. Okay, number 1, what conversation? Number 2, what is the objective of this conversation? In the qualifying, and I'll come back to your question about the probative conversation. The objective of the qualifying conversation is to vet the lead and see if there's a fit and then determine the next step. So it's a vetting conversation. I'm vetting the client and they're vetting me, and we're both deciding, is this worth spending time on? Third question is, so the first question is, what conversation is this? Second one is, what's the objective in this conversation? And the third question is, how do I navigate to the objective? What framework do I use to navigate to the objective? So in other words, how do I determine whether or not there's a fit here? And so the model basically answers all those questions. It's a qualifying conversation. Your job is to vet, use the qualifying conversation framework to organize your vetting questions or qualifying questions. And then in addition to frameworks, the book also contains principles. Principles are the ideas that you embody as you use the framework to navigate to a conversation's objective. So if you break it all down, you strip away you show up and you think, I'm going to show them a bunch of stuff. I'm going to talk about us. I'm going to be brilliant. All these things that we in the creative professions, we reflexively do in the sale, and we do it without thinking too much about it. There's no room for any of that in this model. It's stop and think. What conversation is this? What's your objective? How do you navigate to that objective? Your
So
question
the 4 basically it's your 4 conversations. It's a framework and it's like a map. So creatives, when they get lost in the conversation, always know a way to find back to the conversation or find back to actually to lead the client. Really, if you have this map, you can lead the client through the sales conversations.
I love that you call it a map, because creative people are highly autonomous. That means that's a generalization, but it's largely true, where they don't really want to use systems. They don't want to use scripts, etc. They want the freedom to go where they want. That's why when the studio owner comes back from a new business meeting and you say, how did it go? You'll often hear, oh, it went great. We had scheduled 30 minutes for the meeting and it went 2.5 hours. That's not great. That's you rambling and wasting somebody's time. Maybe in the beginning they were interested, it was interesting, but there was no shape to the conversation because you didn't have an objective. You didn't know where you were going. You didn't have a framework. You were just working on creative instinct, going all over the place, trying to make the meeting last as long as it could. So that's one end of the spectrum. And I used to do that. It's like, so that's just freewheeling completely. That's one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum and how these conversations can go is you show up with scripts. Both of these are really bad ideas. You should not memorize exactly what to say. You should not be working from a script, but you should not be freewheeling either. You should be using a map. The conversation's objective is the destination on the map that you're trying to get to. The framework is a set of tools that you use to navigate to the objective, but it's not a prescribed route.
Mhm.
You are free to get there however you want. Just use the framework and a combination of your intuition and freedom. So it's this middle ground between a script and just winging it. And so I think the approach is, for that reason, it's comfortable to most creative people. It's a little bit of structure to organize the conversation without reining you in completely.
And it's not getting you into all those, like when you look at sales coachings and sales trainings outside the creative industry, it gets very granular. Like a lot of people
Yeah.
teach you about psychology, about hacks, about tricks, they teach you scripts basically. And it's a lot. It's a lot to remember. It's like a profession on its own. And what I love about your frameworks, it's easy to remember. And once you have done this a few times, it becomes intrinsic. It's intuitive. When you go
I think,
stages, yeah. And you have talked like a lot of studios and agencies and creative people over the years. I'm curious. I always wanted to ask you this question. What's an idea or something or a concept or an approach that you've learned over the years that didn't make it into the books?
Oh, so I recorded a Two Bobs podcast episode with David C. Baker yesterday. And one of the things what we were talking about was this idea of customization versus standardization. And so in your services, should you productize your services?
Mhm.
And if you do, should you put prices on those productized services?
Yes.
And I wrote about that in 2018 in Pricing Creativity. And I was adamant in that book that creative firms should customize their services, so don't productize, and customize their pricing, so value price. And in this book, when I went to write about that, I wrote for pages and pages. I felt like I needed to address customization versus standardization because my point of view had changed on it a little bit. But by the time I was done writing about 10 pages, I wrote myself into a new kind of belief, which is there's no right or wrong way to do this. So I ended up with this 2x2 grid of customization versus standardization of your delivery, and then customization or standardization of your pricing. So you end up with 4 quadrants: customized delivery, like bespoke solutions for every client, or productized delivery, productized solutions, standardized productized solutions. Customized pricing, price the client; standardized pricing, price the service or price the time. And I realized that I shouldn't have such a strong point of view that there's only one right way to do this,
Okay.
that it should be customized delivery and customized pricing. It's like everything in life, it's just a series of trade-offs. So you need to understand what the benefits are of each of those quadrants and what the drawbacks are, and then you decide for yourself what's best for you. So what didn't make it? The 10 pages of writing to that conclusion. It ends up being a page and a half and a little 2x2 matrix.
I love that you actually, like, the whole thing evolves, right? Like with the expertise, with the experience you get, and even teaching people and then writing something new after a few years and actually coming to a different conclusion and still being okay with that. A lot of people, creative people especially, wouldn't be okay with that because they think once they've done something, that's it. Like that's the final thing. Like it's final, whatever. So I love that the whole model actually evolved. So I'm curious, because you're coaching and training people for a long time now in the sales aspect, how did the sales process change over the last 10 years?
In my model or in the greater world?
In the greater world, like in your model, maybe both, did your model actually have to adapt? Did something change?
not that I can put my finger on. What's changed, and maybe 10 years isn't a long enough sample, but if you go back to the beginning when I started this business in 2002, so that's 23 years ago next month. Wow, that's a long time. My first message, and it was the first proclamation of the Win Without Pitching manifesto in 2010, was we will specialize. It was the importance. It was the market was fragmenting. So in 2002, my clients were full service marketing communication firms. They did everything for everybody. Whatever you needed done, they would do it. And that's the way I was raised. That was my first job. And basically all the jobs I'd had in the business were I was working for, no, that's not true. I worked for a multinational ad agency for a year. But other than that, I worked for independently owned full service marketing communication firms that were unspecialized and therefore were lacking power in the buy-sell relationship dynamics. So in the beginning, I just banged the specialization drum for 10 years, and people really fought it initially. And then eventually the market just fragmented so much. Like it used to be that our clients were either ad agencies, design firms, or this like full service marketing communication firm, or a public relations firm. And now they are highly specialized businesses that you wouldn't even, some of them you would refer to as agencies. There's a lot of blend of software engineering, consulting, AI, and other weird things. So now you really do have this ecosystem of highly niched, micro-focused businesses where almost everybody does something different from everybody else. And that's not universally true. There's still a percentage of the market that we serve, maybe 20%, where I'm just a provider of service, design, less so advertising. But most of them can declare a narrower discipline, what they do, and market for whom they do it. And then there's an interesting blend of tools that really just makes all these businesses professional services businesses.
So they are specialized. The market is much more specialized these days than
That's a much more succinct way of saying what I just rambled on about. The market is far more specialized today.
Is that a good thing or is that a bad thing?
It's a great thing. It's a great thing because it empowers the clients to get what they want. They don't have to put up with the generalist when a specialist is easily found.
Is the specialist easily found?
Google. Yeah.
So, okay. So when you specialize,
This goes back to your question I haven't answered yet about the probative conversation. The probative conversation is the first conversation, right? It's the objective of the probative conversation is for you to move in the mind of the client or prospective client from a position of a vendor to the expert. So if somebody's looking for some advice on something, they type into Google, and up comes a post you wrote, a book you wrote, a speech you delivered, a podcast you appeared on, or your own podcast. And they listen to what you have to say and they think, oh, that's really helpful. And then they click deeper into your content. And at some point it's, oh, this person, this firm, they really know their stuff. And then when it comes time to hire somebody to help them with whatever that area is, they can send the tender, the RFP out to a whole bunch of different kind of generalist firms. But you're the firm that they see as the expert. You're the one they really want to work with. So they send you the RFP too, and they send it to a few others because they think maybe these guys can do it, and I have to get a bunch of bids.
they want to confirm that the price you have is actually within like market standards.
Or they want to convey a veil of legitimacy to their selection process.
Yeah.
They want to be able to defend the selection process. So in that case, you don't know yet because they haven't interacted with you. They've interacted with your content, and that's the key to the probative conversation. It's the conversation that happens without you present. It happens through your agents of thought leadership and referrers.
Oh,
So they are interacting with your thought leadership, and in their mind, through the interaction with your content, they're quit seeing you as a possible vendor, and they start seeing you as the expert.
so I've read all your books. I listened to your podcast, but something just clicked that didn't click before, and it was like this probative conversation doesn't have to be one-on-one. It actually can be accomplished through your content.
It's
And
always
always should be.
Yeah. Through your reputation, and the biggest driver of your reputation is the content you put out in the world. So people say, I had the probative conversation. And I'll say, what do you mean by that? I told them I was an expert. No, that's not how it works. The probative conversation is the conversation that happens without you present.
That's interesting. I always thought you lead people to the conclusion that you're the expert, but you can actually do that outside of the one-on-one conversation, which actually makes much more sense.
Yeah, it's a hack to call it a conversation, right? I'm squeezing it into this conversational model, but I actually really like the idea of thinking of it as a conversation, but you're not present.
But that's the thing, like good content, it should be a conversation. I like that.
Yeah.
That's
Like I said to you, the manifesto, to me, it's like a child. It's its own thing. It's a child. It's out there it's had 100,000 conversations on my behalf.
exactly. That's beautiful. That's amazing. That's cool. So I know you're short on time today, but that's one thing I want to ask some questions around. And that's basically, you said value is a feeling. And I love that because that actually makes the biggest change, I believe, for anyone that's trying to sell services or productized services or whatever. But it's like the idea that creating value doesn't necessarily mean you have to add on more stuff like marketing and content and whatever.
Yeah.
But it's more like the feeling the client gets. Could you talk a little or explain that a little more?
Yeah. So we tend to think of value in economic terms. And we do some work. So we have multiple clients that are in the interior design space or residential architecture. So these are studios that do interior design for homes or design homes. And there's a step in the value conversation where you determine the value of your services to this client. So you start out with, what do you want? What will we measure to prove that you've achieved what you want? What's the value of getting what you want? And then what would you be willing to pay is the last step. So when you're uncovering the value in the third step, in a marketing firm that's got a client that is selling products, they're going to have some goals. We want to go from 10% market share to 20% market share. Okay, what's that worth for you? Oh, look, every share point's worth this much money. Okay, what's that worth in the bottom line? How much profit? So you can do the math with the client. What's this worth to you? But if you think of an interior designer speaking to a homeowner who wants to do an interior renovation, and you ask, what's the value of this to you? The value is not monetary, but it is extremely valuable. So what's the value to you of coming home to a beautiful home? Oh, I would be relaxed. I would want to entertain more. I would actually invite my family to come home for the holidays, and I would be proud to have people in my house. I would have dinner parties. And when people walked into my home, I would feel comfortable and proud, and I would feel grateful for the ability to invite people into my home and to share that feeling with them where they walk in and they go, oh my God, this place is so beautiful and comfortable. The pride I would feel from that. Now, how do you put a dollar value on that? But that's a value. That is valuable to a person, right? Even though we can't put an economic value on it. So when you go to the fourth step in this case, which is what would you be willing to pay? And you don't ask that question, you lead them. Would you pay in this range? As an example, you effectively use willingness to pay as a surrogate for economic value. You essentially look at this person's net worth and with their not worth per se, but their discretionary income, their ability, you look at their financial means and you make some sort of assessment. I think this person might be willing to pay this much money for that. And so you ask, would you pay this much money to get all of that, to have all of those feelings? No, but I might pay this much. And we're not setting the exact price in this moment. We're beginning the pricing conversation based on value, not based on the time it takes us or the market value of what these services go for. It's like, what's this worth to you? In that example, the client that I just modeled, you can tell just from the tone of my voice as I try it on, there's a lot of value in what an interior designer does.
The way you phrased it actually almost sounded like with that new interior design, that person you model becomes a whole different person. Like they now have parties, they invite people, they're much more proud of their home, of everything pretty much. So it's just
That
that
unlocks them in a way, right?
it unlocks a different personality, like maybe something they have suppressed, or they couldn't bring people to their home and now they can, and maybe that. So that's, I think there's, I love the idea that it actually unlocks a different personality, a new personality, or something that you have hidden before. So this value conversation is about emotion, actually selling more like the emotions than the rational bottom line.
In this case, the value conversation isn't about emotions per se. It's about uncovering the value to the client. And in this example, the value is non-economic. In other examples, it's pretty, it's economic. There's always, it's not even the money that you would make. It's the feeling you have about the money that you would make. Money is a funny thing. And I talk about this in Pricing Creativity. It is both the measure of a metric of value, and it is the value itself. And if you think about it long enough, you'll go crazy, but it cannot be both.
Because it's
The yardstick cannot be the thing that is being measured.
oh great. Yeah, that's okay, but it is.
But it is. So we think money is the value itself.
It's not, it's the yardstick, and we make
Measure of value. And it's okay to use it as shorthand, to use it as a surrogate for the value in some conversations, but we should never lose sight of the fact the money is a store of wealth. It's a measure of wealth. It's not the actual wealth.
it's a placeholder for within a conversation or something for the value that it represents. Okay, that's interesting. So that's a beautiful example. Like it's the yardstick.
Yeah, and that comes from trying to think of the George Gilder is the name of I've learned so much from pricing from Ron Baker and his books. And he's got a podcast where he's interviewed George Gilder, and I don't even know if he's still alive anymore, but he's an old economist. I don't think he's super highly regarded among the world of economists. He's seen as a bit of a heretic, but that he's written about money. And money is, I almost went crazy writing Pricing Creativity. I almost went crazy on the idea that the statement that time is money. I don't know if you've read Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, where the protagonist has a nervous breakdown contemplating the word quality. I wouldn't go so far as to say I almost had a nervous breakdown, but I thought, is time really money? So I started to explore time and money, and there are two different rabbit holes. I've come to the conclusion that very few people on this planet understand time or money, and probably nobody understands both.
Why is that?
How much time do you have?
As much as you need. Or maybe, no, tell me, why not? Why don't we know?
Well, because I just talked about money is that we're confused by money. Is it the thing that we use to measure value, or is it the value itself? And at different times, money, both time and money are different things.
Makes sense, yes. So money, okay, I understand money, but why do we not understand time?
Oh, why do we not understand time? The short answer is, I don't think we know what it is. Really, time is you can describe it a bunch of different ways. It's a human construct designed to measure change that we use to measure change.
Okay.
It's also an element of space, right? So that the time-space continuum, it's another dimension of space. Right?
It is.
So it doesn't exist without space. No space. How much time passed before the Big Bang?
And now we're getting into quantum physics. Okay,
None. The answer is no time passed before the Big Bang. Because with no space, there's no time.
I would love to go deeper on that.
Yeah.
That's interesting. That's
well,
a rabbit hole.
I went down that rabbit hole, and I'm trying not to have these conversations anymore.
What's your conclusion on if time is money or not?
No, it's not. Time isn't money.
But
you understand, it's illogical to understand why people think that way. It's not helpful or even healthy to think that way.
Definitely not healthy. That's true.
And it's not. So Ron Baker and I might diverge on this. He's adamant you should never sell time. I actually think you can strategically, in a 3-option proposal that you would put forward in a closing conversation, and I talk about this in my last 2 books, I think sometimes it makes sense in your cheapest option when a client is underfunding a solution for you to say, "I'll sell you a block of time."
Because
I
it's
don't
the easiest
think
way to sell.
Yeah, I think most businesses, this isn't universally true, and I hold on to this idea less tightly than I used to, but I think most businesses, you shouldn't sell time, but some you can. So I was at my physiotherapist the other day, and he's got a price. It's basically time-based, and that seems fair to me because I don't know how else he would do it. There are more creative ways that he could price, but it just makes the transaction easy if we understand that.
And it's just how we compare things, right? It's like this much time, this much money.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's just something we do automatically. Probably not always the right thing because there are some good, like the services also differ from service provider to service provider. But when you go into the market, you don't always know what the quality is like, what's the difference between the quality. And I think the first thing we look for is the easiest way to compare people is price and the money you get for it, or the services and the money you get for it.
Reminding me of a story. I had a friend who had a big birthday years ago. And as a birthday present, I got my entire back covered in a temporary tattoo. Because the joke was like, "Hey, I got your name and this, was tattooed on my back as my present to you." So it was a temporary tattoo. And the woman who did the tattoo, it took her 2 hours to do it. She used Sharpies. And at the end of it, I said, "Oh, this is great." I said, "Okay, what do I owe you?" And I thought, it's not going to be much. And she said, "Just pay me what you earn in 2 hours." And I thought, that's not fair.
You shouldn't have that conversation after the service.
Yeah, I know, but I just assumed we all make that mistake around pricing. We just make these assumptions, then we don't ask the question in advance.
That was an expensive tattoo.
Oh my God. I thought there are so many different ways I could do the math on this. I will just pay her well, but not that well.
Nice. That's actually a great idea for a birthday present. They should do that.
Yeah, isn't it?
Yeah, my wife's birthday is coming up, so maybe that's something. She's gonna kill me.
It's the tattoo big and ugly, and "Baby, I love you so much" is what I got for you.
And I spend a lot of money on that.
Yeah,
You like it?
we're not going on vacation this year.
Probably not. I'm not gonna do that. Blair, I would love to talk to you forever. I know your time is short. Where can people go to find out more about the 4 conversations?
Yeah, so you can go to winwithoutpitching.com and you'll find links to all of my books there. You can find the 4 Conversations on Amazon. The full title is The 4 Conversations, a New Model for Selling Expertise. Yeah, those are the 2 best ways to do it.
Awesome. Thank you. And thanks for being on the show. I really enjoyed this conversation and I wish we could have had a lot more time. Yeah, thanks for being our guest.
My pleasure, Marko. Great to talk to you.
Thanks for tuning in. My name is Marko Pfann, and I hope to see you all again on our next show where we unfold creative business.